To begin with, I must say that it's quite unprecedented that a nation comes back after 2,000 years, almost 2,000 years of the diaspora and dispersion, and after 2,000 years of being a religion, it suddenly comes up as a nation and comes back to the land of its forefathers. This is unprecedented in any other in the history of humanity. But the thing is that those areas that the Jews were returned to are considered in the world opinion, part of it at least, is considered as Palestinian Arab territory. And the question is, how did this happen? Let me start with saying that the whole thing began with the fact that we had three personalities at some time in 1917. It was a miracle for the Jewish people, I think, after 2,000 years, that those three people gathered together at the same time and the same circumstances that happened. I was intrigued by the fact that in total, the spirit of the world was that these areas are not belong to the Jewish people, but they belong to the Arabs. And I started research at Stanford University 5 years ago. And it took me 5 years to come to a conclusion that those conclusions that the world opinion is gathering is unfounded. So let's go back to the three people who made the whole thing. One of them is Lloyd George, who was the Prime Minister at the time of Great Britain. And the other one is Lord Balfour. And the third one is Chaim Weizmann. Now, it so happened, I don't know. It so happened that in 1917, when the war was still going on between the First World War, between Britain, the Allies on the one hand, and Germany, the German Empire, the Hungarian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire on the other hand. This war was continuing at the time, and the British government was not really doing very well at the war. So it so happened also that the Prime Minister and Lord Balfour were brought up in a very biblical circumstances. They were devout, and they thought that the Christians really owed a great debt to the Jewish people for what happened for the Jewish people in the 2,000 years. Also, it also happened that Chaim Weizmann was acquainted with those two personalities because of services he did at the war. So when all this came together, the British wanted the help of the Jewish people to win the war. And Weizmann was able to convince those two personalities that the Jewish people can promote a lot of help to the war effort of the Allies. So they got together, and it was decided that a declaration would be declared for the erection, for the establishment of a Jewish nation, a Jewish national home in Palestine, in consideration of Jewish help and Jewish promotion of help in the United States, in Russia, and also in Germany and in Britain. So it was a quid pro quo, actually. On the one hand, the Jews gave a lot of help because at the time the Russians fell off the war because of the Bolshevik revolution, and the Italians did very badly, and the British had problems in Gallipoli, and the United States hasn't entered the war yet. So all in all, it turned out that the Jewish people managed the Jewish Zionist organization managed to convince the Russian Jews to help on their side. Brandeis was in the United States head of the Zionist organization, and he was also able to help. And in fact, Lloyd George said in his memoirs that the Jews fulfilled their promise to the full. And the question is whether the British government did the same. The idea was that to establish a Jewish national home in Palestine. Now let's think what a Jewish national home is. It's not a Jewish colony. It's a national home. And why is it a national home and not a state yet? Because the question was whether the experiment will succeed. Because it depends very much on the Jewish people as well. Because if the Jewish people would not have immigrated to Palestine, then the whole thing would have fallen out. So let's see what those documents were. The basis of the Jewish entity in Israel, the Palestine, was the Balfour Declaration. Now, if we look at the Balfour Declaration, we'll find out that what is said there His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. Now, this is a commitment, but not a full commitment, because it says the His Majesty's government view with favor and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. So it was sort of conditional, but this declaration had international recognition because it was confirmed by the other Allied powers and many other countries at the time. It was confirmed by France, it was confirmed by the Vatican, it was confirmed by Italy, and also by the United States and by Japan. So it had an international status at the time. Now, after that, there was the San Remo resolution. After the Balfour Declaration, of course, was on the November 2nd. The San Remo resolution was in 25th of April, 1920, 3 years later, 2.5 years later. Now, this commitment is absolute. It's not conditional. It is not partly, but it's full. It says, the high contracting parties agree to entrust the administration of Palestine to a mandatory. The mandatory will be responsible, now, please note, the mandatory will be responsible for putting into effect the declaration originally made on November 2nd by the British government and adopted by the other Allied powers in favor of the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. What happened in San Remo is that the Allied forces decided to divide the Middle East between the two contenders at the time, the Jewish people and the Arab nation. Let's not forget that there was no Palestine at the time. There was no Iraq at the time. There was no Syria. There was no Lebanon. It was all an Arab country. There were no borders, no kings, no different states. So the Arabs were represented by Hussein of the Hijaz, which is now in Saudi Arabia, and his son Faisal had the negotiations with the British allies, the British and the allies. And it was decided to divide the Middle East between the Jewish people and the Arab nation. Now, the Arab nation includes the Arabs of Palestine, and they were represented by Hussein. And they decided that the Middle East would be divided so that the whole Middle East will go to the Arabs, except Palestine. Palestine on two sides of the Jordan, not just on the left side, on the west side of the Jordan. And this would go to the Jewish national home. Now, if we want to change the situation, we have to refute, we have to abolish the whole resolution, not just part of it. As the Arabs now come over, the Arabs of Palestine, and say, we want a state. This state, the division, put the Arabs all in one, in the whole area of the Middle East, also including the Arab Peninsula, the Arabian Peninsula, and other parts of the area. So this came later on, and after that, this was again put in the Treaty of Sèvres, which adopted exactly the words in the San Remo resolution. And then comes the Treaty of Sèvres, and in section 94, 95, again, there's a division of the whole area between the Arabs and the Jews. And then comes the British Mandate. Now, in all these documents, which are international documents, nothing goes to the Arabs except, in Palestine, I mean, except civil and religious rights. In other words, the Arabs have no national rights at all in Palestine, west of the Jordan, and also parts of the east of the Jordan. Now, the British Mandate states those things very clearly. It says, whereas the principal Allied powers have agreed that the mandatory should be responsible for putting into effect the declaration originally made in November 2nd by the government of His Britannic Majesty and adopted by the said powers in favor of the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. So there is no facilitate or best endeavors. It's the principal Allied powers who had the authority to divide the Middle East. And let me point out that, excuse me, let me point out that at the time, in 1917, the usual situation when a country conquers another country, it annexes that country. But at that time, they decided, because of the 14 points of President Wilson of the United States, they decided to establish the mandate system. The mandate system says that those nations that are not yet ripe to establish independence will be guided by the modern states, like European states, until they reach independence. But this is except Israel, except the Palestine, because that was made for the Jewish national home. So the Allied powers actually got all their authority, their sovereignty over this area from the Turks. The Turks, in section 132 of the Sèvres, Treaty of Sèvres, said that they renounce all their rights, the sovereignty rights over the Middle East, in favor of the Allied powers. So the Allied powers were the only ones who could divide this area between the Jews and the Arabs. Nobody else. And this is until today. Now, also the document says, whereas recognition has thereby been given to the historical connection of the Jewish people with Palestine and to the grounds for reconstituting their national home in that country. Now, there's nothing could be more absolute than saying that those people who are coming to the Palestine, the Jewish people who are coming to Palestine, are not coming for the first time. They're not colonials. They are coming back to their country because there is a recognition of the historical connection of the Jewish people with Palestine. Now, this is so simple and so clear that it's amazing that the whole world ignores this. It's not that the world, it's not that the Security Council or the General Assembly or the ICJ, International Court of Justice, or the Red Cross, all these entities, it's not that they say that this is not valid. They just ignore it as if it never happened, as if it's never existed. That's the problem. And sometimes you get amazed how this happens. How come that the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, ignores those documents which are international documents and part of international law? This is the international law. Now, the Arabs, because they fought alongside the British, not all the Arabs, but the Arabs of the Hijaz of Hussein, they received in consideration the whole Middle East. And it was according to the McMahon Pledge, which McMahon was a high commissioner in Egypt, and he corresponded with and the British government promised in 1915 that those areas will become independent Arab states. And the British really stood by it and gave them Arab states. Now, after the establishment, after the Balfour Declaration, for 5 years, no Arab contested the fact that in Palestine there would be a national home for the Jewish people. Nobody contested that. It only happened after 5 years when Faisal, the son of Hussein, was ousted from the Syrian throne by the French. Then he started thinking, well, I'm going to be a king. And he said, all right, so Palestine should be Arab. The end is that there was a partition of the area promised to the Jewish people. And if you can show me the map. This is the first partition. You see, the area, the Transjordan was part of Palestine. And Churchill wanted to give it to Abdallah, who was another son of Hussein, to please him. So he detached this area from Palestine and gave it to Abdallah and made him first a prince, and then he became king of this area. Now this is against the mandate, the British mandate for the whole of Palestine, because the British mandate speaks about the national home for the Jewish people, and they changed this into being an Arab state. So another Arab state was invented on the land that was promised to the Jewish people. Then comes the second partition, 1947. This left the Jews only with the green color. It's about 10% of what was promised to the Jewish people to establish another Arab state. The Jews accepted that. The Arabs did not accept it. And they denied the Jews at all any self-determination. So they invaded the new Jewish state soon after it was established in 15th of May, 1948. And of course, they lost the war. And this is the Nakba that the Arabs speak of all the time, that they had something like a disaster. But this disaster was because they invaded the Jewish state, not because the Jewish state was established. If they wouldn't have invaded the Jewish state, then wouldn't have happened. I would say that the whole conception is amazing, because how come the world can be wrong in thinking about this area, what's called Judea and Samaria. It's called the West Bank. The West Bank is a misnomer that was given by the Jordanians after they annexed the West Bank illegally. But the area is really Judea and Samaria. And if you think about Judea and Samaria, how can this be an Arab country? How can this an Arab entity? So the whole thing was intriguing. I made this research in 5 years, and my conclusion is that the Jewish people, as a nation, have national rights in the whole area west of the Jordan, the whole area that is considered Palestine, Mandatory Palestine. But the Arabs have no national rights there. All they have is civil and religious rights. And I'm open to questions.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Professor, for an insightful presentation on the grant of rights to Jewish people following the First World War. A few questions of my own, and then we'll open it up to the audience, if I may. Are you saying that the whole international community is wrong when they regard the West Bank as Palestinian Arab territory?
That's right.
That's a short Israeli answer.
That's right. Well, I told you what happened 100 years ago.
Yeah. This
situation hasn't changed until today. If I go through the whole history of the area since 1917 till today, I don't see any change in the status of this area, because in 1948 there was a war, then there was the armistice agreements, then there was the 6-day war, and then there was the annexation of the West Bank to Jordan, and then there was the Oslo Accords, which is really an agreement that is frustrated. By the way, in the Oslo Accords, it's about 300 pages, and there are 5 agreements. None of them speaks about an Arab-Palestinian state. None of them even mentions it. But they speak about peace. They speak about solving the problems by negotiations and not by violence. This comes up in every preamble, in every agreement. And then what we have is that we don't have peace, but we speak about the Palestinian state.
So what should Israel do to convince the world of its legal right to the West Bank?
Well, I don't expect people in Sweden or in Australia or in India to know the exact facts. Israel is doing very little to explain our position. It's like when you go to court and somebody says you owe him $1,000 and you say, well, I don't know whether it's true or not. Maybe you're right, maybe you're not. So the judge is going to decide against you. Because if you don't explain your situation, your status, and properly, you lose your stand in the argument. Now Israel, I'm amazed to say, is putting very little funds into this situation, into explaining the world what the truth is, while the Arabs are pouring billions of dollars to explain the world the opposite, without any foundation at all in international law. I'm not speaking now about who's right and who's wrong. I'm actually asking who has the legal title to this area from the point of international law. The Arabs have no title whatsoever. And Israel is doing very little to explain that.
But the Arabs contend, and they do it very well in the international media, that they are they're the indigenous population of Palestine, and therefore they're entitled to the land on the
Yes, but
basis of self-determination.
self-determination, you've got to put it into at a certain time. Self-determination should have been decided in 1917, not today. The Palestinians declared their independence only in 1988, almost after 80 years. And you can't change the situation by declaring independence. Now, in 1917, there was no Palestinian Arabs. You know that Palestine in 1917 belonged to the Turks. The British conquered Palestine only later, 1918. So there was no Palestine at the time, and the Arabs had no rights in Palestine. They were actually under the Turkish rule. But later on, when the Allied powers who had the authority decided to divide the area between the Arabs and the Jews, the Arabs got their share, and the Arabs include the Arabs of Palestine. So they cannot come after 70 years or 80 years and say, now we want a state. It's, it reminds me of a situation whereby the Jews, the Sephardic Jews, would come over to the United Nations and say, we want a state, because the state that was given to the European Jews, but not to the Sephardic Jews. Now we want a state as well. So the Arabs come over in the areas of Palestine and say, we want a state in 1988, after the whole area was divided, and the San Remo resolution decided that what goes to the Arabs, what goes to the Jews.
But the Arabs will say they've not been waiting 70 or 80 years to make this argument. They contend the British government had no right to pledge Mandate Palestine to the Jews in 1917 because the British never owned Palestine, and one can't give away what isn't yours.
Well, the Allies were the only ones who could decide how to share or how to divide this area, between whom to divide them, because they got their sovereignty from the Turks. And the Allied powers are the only ones, not the United Nations, not any other country could do that. And they decided in 1920, to divide the area as they did. So now you cannot say that they did not have authority, or it's not theirs. It's futile.
Professor, our Q&A is filled up with questions. So I've got just one more from me before I open up to the audience. I think probably will take about half an hour to answer just some of the audience questions. The last question from me, and a rather expansive question: can you envisage peace between Israel and the Palestinians? And under what terms do you think this may eventually happen?
Yes, I can envisage peace. I think peace will come at the end. This will come only on one condition: that the Arabs recognize the Jewish self-determination in the land of Israel, in Palestine. When this happens, and when this really happens, then there will be peace. But as long as they think that they can annihilate the Jewish state, and it's only a matter of time, and that the time is working for them, then this will not happen.
Thank you, Professor. Opening up now, if I may, to the audience, and just for members of the audience that aren't familiar with our format, we tend not to read out names because we're recording this to share later and prefer anonymity. Professor, how did the mandate for Palestine differ from other League of Nations mandates?
Well, it was a League of Nations mandate. The mandate for Palestine was a League of Nations mandate, but the League of Nations confirmed a few mandates. The mandates for Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon were different, totally different than the mandate for Palestine. because the mandates for you can see the difference when you compare the two instruments, one with the other. The mandates for Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon were made to give them independence after a certain period that they will be able to stand alone. The mandate for Palestine was totally different. It was for the sole reason of establishing a Jewish state, a Jewish national home in Palestine. And as I explained, a Jewish national home meant a Jewish state in the end. It was dependent, it really depended very much on how this will succeed. It is an experiment, you know, and the question was whether the Jews will be able to establish a state by becoming a majority. And this is what happened in the end.
So we've had a couple of fairly similar questions, so I may wrap a couple of them up. Does the 1948 UN resolution supersede all previous treaties?
Could it what? Sorry?
But one question is, does not the 1948 UN resolution supersede all the previous treaties?
What was the 1948 resolution?
Well, I think it may mean the
establishment of what, the State of Israel?
Mm.
Well, you're talking about Resolution 181, I think, of the General Assembly.
They don't make clear, but yes, it appears so.
Yeah, well, the General Assembly really does not decide anything. It recommends, and it made a recommendation that Palestine should be divided between Palestine, west of the Jordan River, should be divided between the Jews and the Arabs, as I showed, as I called it, the second partition. Now, it's a recommendation, and if this recommendation would have been accepted by the Arabs and accepted by the Jews, then a treaty should have been signed, whereby a Jewish state would have been established, and an Arab state would have been established, and an international city of Jerusalem would have been also established. But this did not happen. The Arabs rejected vehemently the idea of having a Jewish state in the area of Palestine, and actually they invaded the Jewish state soon after that. So what happened is that this recommendation fell to the ground. It meant nothing, because if they rejected it, it means nothing.
Professor, one of our audience has asked if you're familiar, no doubt you are, with Howard Grief's 2008 book, The Legal Foundation and Borders of Israel under International Law, and if you have an opinion about this thesis. But for those of our audience that may not be familiar, this thesis was that the Jewish people have sovereignty over the entire land of Israel and Palestine as vested in the Jewish people as a result of San Remo. Do you agree that the Jewish people have sovereignty over the entire land?
Have what?
Have sovereignty over the entire land?
Yes. The borders of Palestine were established between the northern border, and the northeastern border was established between France, in an agreement between France and England and Britain at the time. And it was decided that the waters of the Galilee, the waters of the Jordan River, would not be part of Palestine at the time. The eastern border was made with the British government decided on the eastern border on its own, and the southern border was with Egypt, and Egypt was also under a British rule. So it was a sort of a technical borderline, but the whole area was actually designated or aimed at forming a Jewish national home, which will then become a state after the Jews reach majority.
So if we have a legal right according to international law, and we have a moral right, how can we make that a reality without putting the success and future of Israel at risk, by being swamped by a demographic threat and the Jews potentially losing their majority?
Well, the demographic threat is a real threat. But I think that what was the situation of today, whereby the Arabs have control over their own people in education, in almost every single thing, except for army. They don't have an army. Well, they shouldn't have an army. And this situation with the aspirations to vote in Jordan, I think this is the best way to deal with it. But the Arabs are not going to accept it. And the demographic situation is a tedious thing, but it shouldn't really. If there is a real interest in peace from the Arab side, it shouldn't really make any difference.
There's a question on here. It's an important question, and thankfully a short one. Is it feasible or just to ignore the calls for a negotiated Palestinian state alongside Israel?
Well, at the moment, I don't see this happening because it's not practical. The Palestinians are not interested in a state beside Israel. They're interested, even today, to annihilate Israel. Now, the Palestinians, you can see the jihad, and you can see the Hamas, and you can see the Hezbollah, and you can see other places, other entities. They're all aimed at one thing: annihilation of the Jewish state. And as I say, as long as this happens, there will not be peace. So there is no such thing as to live alongside. This is a beautiful phrase, to live alongside Israel. But there is no intention to live alongside Israel. It's to live instead of Israel.
Okay, so do you think that normalization with the UAE will persuade other Arab countries to follow suit, and that may isolate the Palestinians, forcing them to a position where they need to?
Well, I think this was a genius idea, because Netanyahu was working on this for a long time. I know that he's been working on this for a few years, and the idea was to outshoot or to go around the Palestinians, because with the Palestinians there will never be peace as long as they think, they feel that Israel could be annihilated, and this is the situation today. So if the Arabs of the Emirates, if the Arabs of Sudan and Saudi will do peace with Israel, real peace, not peace for land, not peace for bribe, but real peace, and the nations will do peace, not like the Jordanians, who are the Jordanian public is against the Israel. It's only, the peace is really a cold peace. I'm talking about real peace. Then perhaps this will affect the Palestinians to know that time is working against them. Until today, the Palestinians thought that time was working with them, but it's not so.
Professor, I'm going to again mix up a couple of questions here. Given the legal background that you've described, there is almost unanimous agreement that Israel's occupancy of territory beyond the 67 lines is illegal under international law, and there seems to be no real challenge to these allegations.
Right.
You've partly addressed that, but how important is it in any future negotiations that the parties involved understand the legal position?
Well, today it's axiomatic. Today, the West Bank or Judea and Samaria, our Palestinian Arab territory, is axiomatic. In other words, if you say it's not so, it's like saying that the world is not round, not like a ball, but it's flat. It's just, you cannot go anywhere and say that these areas are not Palestinian, because the Palestinians were working on this for the last 50 years, since 1967, and saying that this is Arab land. And this has been accepted by the whole world. It's like the West Bank. It has been accepted instead of Judea and Samaria. When you repeat something many times, you start believing yourself, and you start believing others to believe you as well. So I think that a lot has to be invested in the idea to change the idea, of the world, to see the truth, to see what's real, to see what's international law, what it means. And if the International Court of Justice made the mistake of saying that those areas are Palestinian Arab territories without even having to explain why. I mean, they made a decision, a judgment of tens of dozens of pages, and not even one word says why this area is a Palestinian Arab territory. So a lot of it has to be invested to change the situation.
Professor, I've had a few questions asking for clarification of the surrounding historical matters. One is that the Balfour document, I've never thought about this myself, the Balfour document was originally a letter from Lord Balfour. How did it change from a letter to a declaration?
No, the letter was a declaration.
The letter was a declaration.
The letter was the declaration, but it was in fact a letter or a declaration by the British government to the Jewish people, which were represented by the Zionist organization. As I say, this document became international by the fact that it was endorsed and confirmed. You can see from the other documents that I read now, it says it has been adopted and confirmed by the other nations, by the principal allied powers, and by the other powers as well. And then it was put into the mandate, which was endorsed by 51 states, all the states during the League of Nations. So this declaration the letter is the declaration, and it is an international document, actually.
So can you clarify when the borders of Mandate Palestine were decided in 1920 to 22, before the severance of Transjordan? Our audience member said he asks because the San Remo resolution stated that borders were to be determined later.
Right.
Yeah, not in April 20.
Yeah, well, this is an interesting thing. The borders actually were determined on a practical basis. They were not decided by the Allies. They were decided by Britain. In the north and northeast, it was decided in an agreement between Britain and France. In the east, it was decided by Britain alone, because Britain had the control of Transjordan. In the south, it was decided by Britain alone, because the Sinai and Egypt were under British control at the time. So the borders were actually decided only later. And before they were decided, the Jordan was detached from Palestine, before the borders were decided. In other words, the borders had to be, Transjordan would never have been established or erected. The borders were to be between Palestine and Iraq. And then came in Transjordan to please Abdallah and to prevent him from making war against France. It's amazing how this happened. I mean, Churchill was in Jerusalem, and he called Abdallah to him to see him. And he said, look, we want to make you a prince of this area. And Abdallah thought it was too small for him, at the time. And he said, on one condition, you don't fight our allies, the French. Because Abdallah went with an army to fight the French because they ousted his brother from being king, from the throne of Syria. This is a whole complicated story. But the British detached Transjordan from Palestine before the borders were actually fixed. So the borders were not actually fixed by the Allied powers, as it says in the documents, but by Britain alone, and in the north between Britain and France.
So, did you investigate in your research whether Article 25 of the mandate does that allow, or did that allow Britain the right to partition the mandated territory?
Sorry, could you repeat your question?
It's Article 25 of the mandate.
Article 25, yeah.
Yes, which did that give Britain the right to partition the mandated territory?
I'm not sure about that. Not sure about that at all, because actually Churchill asked the legal department in the Colonial Office in London what to do, how to detach Transjordan from Palestine. And they gave him the idea of 25. Now, Article 25 says that it could withhold, it did not say that it could detach the area from Palestine, but it could withhold that area for a different situation. So Britain could have done that for a short period. I think to withhold is intermediate period. But Britain decided to change the whole situation and use Article 25 to detach Jordan from Palestine.
You mentioned in your talk that Lloyd George, Balfour, felt that a debt was owed by Christians to Jews, and that there was also a sense of debt over their help that Weizmann had given during World War I. But the Muslim population in Mandate Palestine may have felt, well, what's a debt between Christians and Jews got to do with us? And if Weizmann had helped in some way, give him a medal, but not a land. Where did Muslims fit into this thinking?
Well, we have to see the things as they were at the time. At the time, the Arabs of Palestine fought alongside the Turks against the British. So the British owed them nothing. It owed them no allegiance at all. Palestine, the Arabs of Palestine were represented by Hussein, who was the Emir, the Sharif of Mecca. They were represented by him. And he agreed that they would not have a state, but they would have civil and religious rights and nothing else. So at the time when this all happened, the British government or the Allies had the whole authority, full authority, to divide the area between the Arabs and the Middle East, between the Arabs and the Jews. And the Arabs had no say in it. So it might today, one may think, well, this is not just. But I'm not talking about justice now. I'm talking about who has the legal title under international law. Under international law, the Arabs have no national rights whatsoever in Palestine.
So why has Israel never asserted the provisions of Article 80 of the UN Charter?
Well, sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't, but they did not insist on it.
Right.
They did not insist. Now, what Article 80 says is that the situation that was before will continue to happen, will continue to prevail, even later on. And if there was a mandate, the rights that were taken from the mandate will continue even later on. And Article 80 really leaves the situation as it is, as it was in 1917, until this very moment, until today.
The 1911 Encyclopedia Britannica, which was, of course, the closest written one to the Balfour Declaration, described the population saying the inhabitants of Palestine are composed of a large number of elements, differing widely in ethnological affinities, language, and religion, and speaking no less than 50 languages in Jerusalem alone. Today, we can be in no doubt that there is a population who identify as Palestinian, but there wasn't around the time of the Balfour Declaration. How did this come about?
Well, the 50 languages were actually of religious affinities. In other words, there were Greeks, there were Maronians, there were all sorts of entities that lived in Jerusalem and worshipped God, everybody in his own way. But actually, you can say that there were Christians, Arabs, Muslim Arabs, and Jews in Jerusalem and in the whole of Palestine. The Arabs and the Christians amounted to about 90% of the population. The Jews were only 10%. And the idea of establishing a national home for the Jewish people is to make the Jews the majority by immigration, by giving them the possibility to establish their homes and colonies on the land, and also by giving them the possibility of acquiring a Palestinian passport, Palestinian citizenship. And this was only for the Jews, not for the Arabs. So if we talk about who has the right, the legal right under international law, it cannot be for the Arabs. The mandate, the British mandate, was not made for the Arabs, although the Arabs were mentioned there, but they were mentioned for religious and civil rights only.
One of our audience teaches this period of history and has said that people state that what you've been saying is no longer the status quo, and we now have to go with the new status quo, which means, of course, arguments against Israel.
What's the new status quo?
Well, I think that the new status quo is that whether or not we have a legal right to the West Bank, the position that's accepted throughout the world is that that is territory that should belong to the Palestinians.
Well, I don't know whether I would say that this is a status quo, but the rights are quite clear, to me at least. And according to the investigation I made, they're quite clear that the Arabs have no national rights in this area. And if we look at the situation that happened since 1948 or since 1947, no change has happened to change the status quo by the fact that Israel conquered the West Bank. You have Article 242 of the Security Council resolution, and it says that Israel should withdraw from territories, not from all the territories, not from the territories, but from territories captured during the Six-Day War. Now, territories, it doesn't say that from every territory, but territories. So if Israel withdrew from Sinai, if it withdrew from parts of Jordan, and the withdrawal was, say, like 80% of the territory, I think Israel has done its share, according to 242.
But an argument's been put by, talking about how the world views it. An argument's been put by the prosecutor in the International Criminal Court that the court must treat Palestine as a state for the purposes of jurisdiction, because states parties to the Rome Statute have treated Palestine as a state party. Can that argument have any merit?
No, it cannot, because let me explain. I think I have already stated before that whoever had the authority to divide this area, who had the authority of sovereignty to divide the area between the Arabs and the Jews, were the principal allied powers. And they alone could decide on that. Now, you cannot come after 100 years and say, it's a state. The whole idea of making Palestine, the Arabs in Palestine, a state is wrong, and it's not. It has no foundation in international law. You cannot say that a party is a state party if it's not a state. It has no sovereignty over anything, and it cannot be regarded as a state. And this is what Israel said to the court, to the IIC.
We've got time for two questions. One of our audiences sent me one on the QA and chased me up on the chat, so I will ask it. Around 20 years ago, Queen Rania of Jordan suggests that unofficially all Palestinians should become Jordanian citizens. This wasn't made official, and would this have been in Israel's interests?
I don't know. I'm not sure about that, whether it's in Israel's interest to have the Palestinians Jordanians. But you mean the situation of today or the time of the annexation?
I think it means back then. It's 20 years ago. So,
oh,
yes,
20 years ago.
20 years.
Not more than that.
Yes.
Not
No,
before 1967.
No, not before 67. I'm told this was a secret possible deal about 20 years ago.
Well, I think this is a good idea. If
Yes.
it's only 20 years ago, it's a very good idea. And this is what I think should be, because the Arabs should have full authority to go around their destiny in the West Bank and in Gaza. But if they have to vote in parliament to make their national aspirations is in Eastern Palestine, which is now Transjordan. Eastern Palestine is now Transjordan.
Yes. We've got time for one last question. I suppose we're fairly quick, but it's an excellent question. How can we, and a good one to finish on, how can we better correct the misrepresentations on international law and Israel and educate on the issues you've addressed?
Well, I think there is a lot of to be involved in that, to be invested. Teaching the truth is very important, especially to the world. And I think that the concept that prevails today is a wrong concept. And I don't think we're doing enough for that. For example, we say two-state solution. This is the wrong thing. It's not two-state solution, because Israel already exists. For 72 years it exists. It's a viable state. It already exists. Instead of saying we want to establish a Palestinian state, we say two-state solution. So it's using the Arab narrative, which is wrong. We should first of all change our narrative, change our concept, and change the concept in the world, especially with the friendly nations. Take, for example, the EU. The EU is against Israel all the time. I try to bring some ambassadors of Germany, Britain, Czechoslovakia, and other places to Ariel. And the British ambassador said, I won't come. I said, why? He said, location counts. So actually, when we speak about an area that is Palestinian area, then they think that that it has been taken from the Arabs. But this is wrong, and it should be educated in this line.
Professor, thank you so much. To the many people who asked questions, we didn't have time to ask everything. I hope we've still managed to cover a very wide number of topics, but my apologies to those whose questions I couldn't answer. Professor, it's been very enlightening and very interesting talking to you. We could have gone on, I'm sure, all night. Unfortunately, time doesn't allow. Again, if anybody wants to support our work, please visit the UKLFI charity. And on behalf of everyone at UKLFI, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you. It was my pleasure, actually, and I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you. Good evening.
Good evening.